It's 221 BC. For over 200 years, 7 kingdoms have been tearing each other apart in what historians simply call the Warring States period. Constant war, shifting borders, millions dead. Then, one king, barely 38 years old, finishes what should have been impossible. He conquers all 6 rivals. He doesn't just win a war, he invents a title that never existed before. Qin Shi Huang, First Emperor. China, as one nation, begins today. Unification wasn't just armies standing down. Qin Shi Huang rewired the entire civilization in a decade. One writing system across the whole empire, one currency, one legal code, roads and canals connecting regions that used to speak different dialects and use different money. Imagine every country in Europe suddenly running the same software update overnight, whether they wanted it or not. That's what happened here, and it worked terrifyingly well. But absolute power came with a side effect nobody warns you about: total consuming fear of death. Qin Shi Huang became convinced immortality was out there, waiting to be found. He sent a court magician named Shu Fu across the Eastern Sea with 3,000 young men and women to find the mythical islands where immortal beings lived. They sailed off with the emperor's full confidence. They never came back. If he couldn't cheat death, he'd out-engineer it. Deep underground near Xi'an, he ordered an entire empire built for his corpse. An underground palace, a ceiling inlaid with jewels mapped like the night sky, and rivers of actual liquid mercury, mechanically pumped to flow like the real Yangtze and Yellow River outside. Crossbows were rigged on triggers to fire automatically at anyone who broke in. This wasn't a tomb, it was a second kingdom, built to run without him. Over 8,000 life-size terracotta soldiers, each one with a unique face, individually crafted, buried in battle formation for over 2,000 years before a farmer accidentally rediscovered them in 1974. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Roughly 20% of that mausoleum still hasn't been touched. Not because nobody's curious, because the mercury is still down there, and it's still dangerous. So how did the man obsessed with cheating death actually die? At 49, on a tour of his own empire, from drinking mercury elixirs his own alchemists swore would make him immortal. The tomb he built to defeat death still leaks mercury vapor from the ground today, over 2,000 years later. He didn't just fail to become immortal, he accidentally embalmed the ground around himself in the very poison that killed him. His empire, built on speed and force, didn't survive him. Rebellions tore it apart just 15 years after unification, barely a blink after everything he'd built. But the apparatus stayed. The roads, the writing system, the idea of one China. The next dynasty to take the throne, the Han, would rule for 4 centuries and give their name to something still used today. Over 1 billion people call themselves Han Chinese. Under the Han, trade routes stretched west for thousands of miles, linking China to Central Asia, Persia, and eventually Rome. A network historians would later name the Silk Road. Chinese silk reached senators in a city its merchants had never seen. And back home, something quieter, but arguably more important than any conquest, was about to happen in a workshop, using garbage. Around 105 AD, a court official named Kai Lun figured out how to make paper. Not from expensive silk or bamboo, but from old fishing nets, tree bark, rags, and rope scraps. Stuff nobody wanted. Before this, writing meant carving into bone, bamboo strips, or turtle shell. Kai Lun turned garbage into the single most important information technology before the internet. He didn't get famous for it in his own lifetime the way you'd expect. He just quietly changed how every civilization on Earth would eventually record its own memory. By the Tang Dynasty, monks were reproducing entire Buddhist texts using carved wood blocks, mass printing, centuries before Gutenberg's printing press existed in Europe. China had this technology solved by roughly the 7th century. Europe wouldn't catch up for another 700 years. While medieval European monks were still copying books by hand, one page at a time, Chinese printers were already stamping out hundreds of identical copies in an afternoon. Here's where it gets almost too poetic. Tang Dynasty alchemists were doing exactly what Qin Shi Huang's alchemists had done centuries earlier, hunting for an elixir of immortality. Instead, mixing sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal, they accidentally invented something that could kill in an instant instead of prevent death forever: gunpowder. The literal Chinese name for it translates to flaming medicine. The search for eternal life, twice in this story, accidentally produced the opposite. The last of the four great inventions came together slowly. A magnetized, ladle-shaped device called a Sinan during the Warring States period, refined by the 11th century into a floating, magnetized needle that could point ships home across open ocean with no landmarks in sight. Paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass. Four inventions, all born in China, all reaching Europe 400 to 600 years later. Francis Bacon himself would later credit these four things with building the modern world. By the height of the Tang Dynasty, the capital city, Chang'an, was arguably the largest, most cosmopolitan city on Earth. Merchants, monks, and diplomats from Persia, Korea, Japan, and the Arab world walking the same streets. Poetry flourished. Trade flourished. If you wanted to see the entire known world in one place in the 8th century, you came here. Then came the Song Dynasty, and with it, an idea so far ahead of its time, it's almost unsettling. Paper money. Real, government-issued currency made of paper, centuries before Europe would try anything similar. Song capitals held over 1 million residents each, a scale of urban life nowhere else on the planet had reached yet. This wasn't a kingdom of farmers anymore. This was a kingdom of cities. Then, under the Ming Dynasty, China does something it will later almost entirely erase from its own ambitions. In 1405, an admiral named Zheng He, a Muslim born in landlocked Yunnan province, taken prisoner as a child during a Chinese invasion, set sail commanding the largest naval fleet the world has ever seen. 317 ships, nearly 28,000 men, soldiers, merchants, doctors, astrologers. The largest treasure ships stretched roughly 137 meters long, carrying over 500 people each. Now hold that number for a second, because 87 years later, Christopher Columbus would cross the Atlantic in a ship called the Santa Maria, about 30 meters long. Zheng He's flagship wasn't just bigger, it was nearly 5 times longer, decades before Columbus even left port. 7 voyages, East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, Southeast Asia, all reached by Chinese ships before European ones. And then, after Zheng He's death, a new emperor loses interest entirely. The shipyards in Nanjing are abandoned. The blueprints are lost. China, holding the most advanced navy on Earth, simply turns around and looks inward instead. Where did the resources that once built ocean-crossing treasure ships go? Into the ground, and into stone, a massive expansion of the Great Wall, built not to explore the world, but to keep threats from the north out of it. The most outward-looking nation on the planet had just made the single most consequential inward turn in its own history. While China's attention turned to its own borders, Europe kept pushing outward, into the Americas, into Africa, into the Indian Ocean routes Zheng He's fleet had already mapped and abandoned. The gap wouldn't be visible for centuries, but it was quietly opening, voyage by voyage, exactly while nobody in either empire was watching the other closely enough to notice it happening. Centuries later, ships reappear off China's coast. This time they're European, and this time the intentions aren't curious, they're extractive. Trade demands turn into forced treaties. Opium floods in, deliberately, to drain silver out of China and addict its population. Wars follow. Wars China, once the most technologically advanced civilization on the planet, now loses. Ports are forced open at gunpoint. Hong Kong is signed away. Foreign powers carve out zones of control inside China's own cities. The nation that invented gunpowder, printing, and paper money now finds itself outgunned, outmaneuvered, and humiliated by empires that were, less than 500 years earlier, sailing ships a fraction the size of its own. But here's the thing about a civilization that already survived a first emperor's 15-year collapse, wave after wave of invasion, and centuries of internal war. It doesn't disappear. It adapts. Again. The writing system Qin Shi Huang standardized is still legible today. The paper Chai Lun invented from garbage is still the basis of nearly all written communication on Earth. The Silk Road's descendants still move goods across the same regions, just faster now. So picture that 38-year-old king again, standing over a newly unified China in 221 BC, so afraid of death that he built an underground empire and drank poison trying to escape it. He got exactly the immortality he was chasing, just not the kind he wanted. Not his body, his civilization. 4,000 years later, it's still here. If Africa's story moved you, China's is proof this keeps happening everywhere. Empires rising, inventing, collapsing, and somehow outlasting themselves. Next up, an empire that conquered more land in 25 years than Rome did in 4 centuries. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And tell me below, which civilization should Horizon uncover next?